A distillation column tells you what's wrong with it one tray at a time, if you're willing to look at the actual numbers instead of a single score somebody's averaged together for you. I've been a board operator at Meridian Refining for 22 years, the last 9 as shift supervisor on the crude unit, and the specific habit that's kept every person on my shift alive across 2 decades of running that column is pulling up the raw temperature profile, tray by tray, whenever something feels off, rather than trusting a single composite number that can hide a real problem underneath 5 other readings that happen to still look fine. My name is Miles Cortez. My daughter-in-law, Naomi, is Meridian's Vice President of Digital Process Optimization, the woman who spent the last 2 years building and championing UnitPulse, a predictive analytics platform that condenses dozens of individual sensor readings across each process unit into a single composite health score, installed on every control room screen across the refinery. This is a story about Naomi, about a system she genuinely believed had made our control rooms safer and more efficient than anything 2 generations of operators managed staring at raw trend lines, and about a July night when UnitPulse's composite score sat calmly in the low 80s, comfortably green, while one specific tray on my column was quietly heading toward a coking condition that score had no way to clearly show me. UnitPulse came online across Meridian's process units 3 years ago, a platform designed to aggregate dozens of individual temperature, pressure, and flow readings from each distillation column, reactor, and heat exchanger into a single composite health score, updated continuously and displayed prominently on every control room screen, replacing a wall of individual trend charts that operators had traditionally had to scan manually, tray by tray, to build their own mental picture of a unit's condition. Naomi had pushed hard for the system from its earliest proposal, arguing, correctly, that a board operator monitoring 6 or 7 process units simultaneously during a busy shift genuinely benefited from a single, prioritized number telling her where to focus her limited attention first, rather than needing to mentally synthesize 40 individual trend lines under pressure. UnitPulse isn't replacing the raw data, Miles, she told me, more than once, across a family dinner table I'd been eating at since she married my son. It's still all there if you want to drill into it. The composite score just tells you, at a glance, which unit needs your attention most urgently, so you're not spending your first 5 minutes of a shift scanning 40 charts before you even know where to look. I don't doubt the composite score's useful for triage most of the time, Naomi. What I'm telling you is that averaging multiple readings together can hide exactly the kind of problem where one single tray is drifting badly while the rest of the column still looks completely normal, because 5 good readings and 1 bad one can still average out to something that reads comfortably green on a summary score. I want to be fair to what UnitPulse actually got right, because this isn't a story about a system built carelessly, or a daughter-in-law who'd stopped caring about the operators working the units she'd built her career optimizing. UnitPulse's composite scoring had genuinely helped operators catch several real developing problems faster than the old wall of charts approach across its first 2 years, exactly the kind of careful, defensible engineering Naomi had built her career on since joining Meridian's digital operations team fresh out of a chemical engineering program, and I never once doubted she believed in it completely, right down to personally reviewing every incident the system's dashboard flagged. What the system didn't have, and what nobody building it had fully understood the danger of, was any prominent way to flag the specific situation where one individual sensor reading was diverging sharply from its neighbors while the composite score, averaging across all of them, continued reading comfortably normal, a mathematical blind spot baked into the very design of any aggregate number built to smooth out noise. That could, under exactly the wrong circumstances, smooth out a genuine early warning right alongside the noise it was designed to filter. I'd watched Naomi build her career at Meridian from almost the beginning, first as a young engineer fresh out of school who used to ask me endless questions about the board during her rotation through operations, and later as the person who'd married my son and become, in every way that mattered, family long before UnitPulse ever existed as more than an idea in a proposal meeting. I understood, better than most of the operators who argued with her purely as a distant corporate voice behind a system they hadn't chosen, exactly how much careful thought she'd put into UnitPulse's design, and exactly how personally she took every incident report the system generated, which was part of why our disagreement over its blind spot never once felt, to either of us, like a fight about whether the system deserved to exist in the first place. I need to explain the specific hazard this story turns on, because it's the actual center of everything that happened that July night, and because it's exactly the kind of individual sensor divergence a composite score, built specifically to average across many readings, was never designed to prominently surface on its own. Meridian's crude distillation column processed a blended crude slate that had shifted, over the previous 18 months, to include a higher proportion of a particular heavy crude source known within the industry for a somewhat higher tendency to foul certain tray types under specific temperature conditions, a gradual operational change that had gone through proper engineering review, but that meant the column's tray 22, a lower tray in the column stripping section, ran a meaningfully elevated coking risk compared to the column's other trays under this newer crude blend, a risk the column's other trays simply didn't share to the same degree. When tray 22's individual temperature sensor began drifting upward, a slow, specific signature of early coke deposit building on that tray's surface, restricting flow and driving localized temperature higher, the composite score, averaging that one elevated reading against roughly 30 other trays running entirely normal temperatures, moved only slightly, from the high 80s down into the low 80s, a shift well within the range operators had learned, across 2 years of unit pulse operation, to treat as ordinary day-to-day fluctuation rather than a specific warning about one particular tray. I'd first raised this exact concern with Naomi nearly a year before this story's events, after a training exercise had walked our shift through a hypothetical coking scenario, and I'd realized, working through the math myself, exactly how much a single tray's divergence could get diluted inside a 30-tray composite average. Unit pulse composite score is weighted, miles. It's not a simple flat average. The algorithm does give more weight to trays showing anomalous behavior relative to their own historical baseline. I understand there's weighting involved, Naomi, but I ran the numbers myself off that training scenario, and even weighted, one tray drifting badly can still get diluted enough inside a 30-tray composite that the overall score stays comfortably green well past the point where I'd want to already be looking closely at that specific tray. I want a prominent, automatic alert specifically for single tray divergence from its own historical baseline, separate from the composite score entirely, not buried in a submenu I have to remember to go check manually during a busy shift. I'll take that to the engineering team as a design request, but I can't have operators across the refinery losing confidence in a composite score that's genuinely caught real problems faster than the old system did, based on one training exercise's math rather than an actual incident. I remember leaving that conversation understanding exactly where Naomi was standing, even as I disagreed with the conclusion she'd reached from there. She wasn't wrong that Unipulse's composite score had genuinely caught things the old wall of charts approach had occasionally missed simply from operator fatigue, and I wasn't wrong that a single tray's story could still get lost inside an average built from 30 others. The genuine difficulty was that both of those things were true at once. And nobody on her engineering team had yet built the specific tool that would let both truths coexist on the same screen without asking an operator to choose, mid-shift, between trusting the summary number in front of them and going digging through raw charts on a hunch. I thought often, across that year of arguing the point at family dinners, about the old operator who trained me on this exact column over 2 decades earlier, a quiet, exacting man named Walsh who used to say that a distillation column had no interest in being summarized, it simply was what it was, tray by tray, and the job of a good operator was never to make peace with a convenient number when the column itself was still telling a more complicated story underneath it. The night this story turns on was the 3rd week of July, a warm, uneventful shift by most measures, Unipulse's composite score for the crude unit sitting at 82, comfortably within the range my shift had learned to treat as routine over 2 years of watching that number settle somewhere in the 70s and 80s on almost any given night. I was doing my own hourly walk of the raw tray-by-tray trend charts, a habit I'd never once dropped across 22 years regardless of what any composite score showed, when I noticed tray 22's individual temperature running nearly 11 degrees above where its own 2-year historical baseline said it should be sitting at this point in a normal run, a specific, gradual upward drift that, laid against the tray's own history rather than averaged against 30 other trays, read as an unmistakable early warning. Board, this is Miles, I've got tray 22 running 11 degrees above its own baseline on the raw trend chart, and the composite scores still sitting at 82. I want a manual sample pulled from that tray before this drift goes any further. Composites showing green across the whole column, miles, nothing flagged tonight. You want to pull a sample based on one tray's raw number when the overall health score's fine. I want a sample pulled because tray 22's own history says 11 degrees above baseline isn't fine, whatever 30 other trays happen to be averaging out to tonight. I'd rather explain an unnecessary sample pull to Naomi in the morning than explain to her why I let a cooking condition run because a composite score stayed green while one specific tray was quietly cooking itself. I want to describe what I actually did next, because it fell squarely within my formal authority as shift supervisor and, honestly, within the one habit every board operator on this crew has followed since long before unit pulse existed, that a raw individual reading diverging meaningfully from its own historical baseline gets manually investigated immediately, regardless of what any summary number displayed elsewhere on the board happens to say. I ordered the manual sample pull from tray 22 myself, a procedure that added roughly 40 minutes to the night's routine and pulled one of my operators away from other duties, an operator named Reggie who'd worked this unit alongside me for 6 years and who didn't need much convincing once I showed him the raw trend chart sitting beside the still comfortable composite score on the main display. 11 degrees above baseline and climbing, miles. I can see why the composite's not flagging it. 30 other trays running dead normal is going to swallow one tray's drift pretty completely in any kind of average. The sample came back showing early-stage coke deposit exactly consistent with the elevated temperature signature, confirmed under a bench analysis roughly 90 minutes after I'd first spotted the divergence on the raw trend chart, a finding serious enough that I called for an immediate, controlled adjustment to that specific tray's operating conditions, reducing localized temperature and flow to arrest the coking process before it progressed to anything requiring a full unit shutdown. Those 90 minutes waiting on the lab results carried their own particular weight, the two of us standing over the raw trend chart watching tray 22's temperature continue its slow climb while the composite score on the main display barely moved, still sitting comfortably in the low 80s the entire time, a strange, unsettling split-screen effect where one number kept insisting everything was fine while another number, the one I actually trusted, kept insisting otherwise. Reggie kept glancing between the two displays more than once in that stretch, the particular look of a man who'd worked this board for 6 years and had never before watched two numbers on the same screen tell him such different stories at the same time. I stayed through the shift change to walk my findings through personally with the day supervisor, then called Naomi directly rather than letting the incident report reach her secondhand through the normal chain, aware she'd want to see the raw data herself before anyone else's summary of it reached her. 11 degrees above a 2-year baseline on one tray, miles, while the composite score sat at 82 the entire time. I need to see exactly how that math worked, because on paper that composite score should have moved more than it did if one tray was genuinely diverging that badly. I ran the same question myself the second the sample came back, Naomi. It's not that the algorithm's broken, it's that 30 trays running normal is a lot of denominator to dilute one tray's numerator against, even with the weighting your team built in. I've been telling you for a year that the composite score's real strength, smoothing across a lot of noise, is also exactly its blind spot for the one situation where a single tray's story matters more than the whole column's average. Naomi drove out to the refinery herself that morning, having pulled Unipulse's full sensor log and run her own analysis of exactly how tray 22's 11-degree divergence had translated into only a modest composite score movement, and I want to describe the conversation honestly, because it wasn't simple vindication for either of us, even with hard numbers sitting in front of both our eyes confirming exactly the dilution effect I've been describing for a year. 11 degrees above baseline on a coking-prone tray, diluted down to a 2-point composite score movement, miles. That's not the algorithm malfunctioning, that's the algorithm doing exactly the smoothing job it was built to do, applied to exactly the one situation where smoothing was the wrong instinct. I've been telling you for a year that a composite score built to filter noise is going to filter out a real signal sometimes too, Naomi. I didn't have anything beyond one training exercise as math until last night made the gap impossible to keep deferring. This wasn't a system that failed, it was a system trusting its own core design assumption, that averaging many readings together produces a more reliable picture than any single reading alone, in exactly the one scenario where that assumption doesn't hold. Which is exactly the gap I need to sit with, and I know that now in a way I genuinely didn't let myself believe a year ago, when you first raised it over dinner. I wasn't dismissing you because I'd stopped trusting your judgment, Miles. I built unit pulse because I watched operators during my own training rotation drowning in 40 individual trend charts, missing real problems simply from information overload, and I genuinely believed a well-designed composite score solved that completely. I think I let myself believe a good average was the same thing as a complete picture, right up until last night showed me a scenario where those two things came apart in exactly the way you described a year ago. I know that, Naomi. I'm not angry at you for wanting to solve information overload. I remember exactly how overwhelming this board looked my first few years before anyone thought to build something like unit pulse. I'm telling you that the one time it mattered, a comfortable 82 was asking every operator on this shift to trust a number that could never have shown them what one specific tray, with its own specific history on this specific crude blend, was quietly telling anyone willing to look at it directly. She was quiet for a long moment, looking at the raw trend chart still open on the control room's main display, and I watched her run the same calculation I imagined she'd been running since the sample results reached her, the particular engineer's math of how many other units, across 3 years and however many trays each column carried, might have carried the same invisible single-sensor dilution gap without one supervisor's hourly habit of checking raw charts happening to catch it in time. I keep thinking about the version of last night where you'd stopped walking those raw charts yourself years ago, once Unipulse came online and everyone else on the shift started trusting the composite number instead, she said, finally, still looking at the screen, or the version where Reggie had talked you out of the sample pull because the composite was reading fine and the shift was already stretched thin. I don't like sitting with how much of last night came down to you personally deciding an hourly habit couldn't ever become optional, no matter how good the number on the summary screen looked. I don't love sitting with that either, Naomi. A system this good shouldn't need one supervisor's 22-year-old habit as its last line of defense before a coking condition runs unchecked. That's not a compliment to me, it's a description of exactly the gap we both need to close. You built something genuinely good across 3 years, and I've never once told this crew otherwise, but genuinely good isn't the same as complete, and I think somewhere in the last year you let yourself believe a well-designed average could stand in for looking at the column itself, when Walsh spent half my first year here teaching me that a column has no interest in being summarized. What Naomi and I built together over the following months, working with her engineering team directly, was a standing single-sensor divergence alert added prominently alongside the composite score on every control room display, automatically flagging any individual reading drifting meaningfully from its own historical baseline regardless of how that reading's shift translated into the broader composite number, closing the exact gap that had let 3 otherwise excellent years of composite scoring quietly inherit the one blind spot built into any aggregate number by design. I still walk the raw tray-by-tray charts every hour, exactly as I did the night before Unipulse existed and exactly as I will the night after whatever eventually replaces it, though Reggie, I've noticed, checks the new single-sensor alert panel unprompted now at the start of every shift, a habit he picked up, he told me once, specifically from that July night. Naomi and I talk about Unipulse's ongoing refinement most Sundays now, over the same family dinner table she's been sitting at since she married my son, except the conversation carries a specific new weight neither of us fully had before that July night. She told me once that the hardest part of the whole episode wasn't adding the divergence alert at all, it was sitting with how completely 3 clean years had let her trust a composite score's core design assumption as complete, right up until her own father-in-law's habit of checking raw charts finally made the gap impossible to keep deferring. A distillation column tells you what's wrong with it one tray at a time, if you're willing to look at the actual numbers instead of a single score somebody's averaged together for you, and what I've learned, watching a system my own daughter-in-law built get this one thing wrong for a year before finally getting it right, is that the most dangerous gap in a genuinely well-built system is often the one built directly into the math itself, the exact same averaging that makes a composite score useful for triage on most nights being the exact thing capable of hiding the one night it matters most. It took an 11-degree drift on one tray, a 40-minute sample pull, and a father-in-law and daughter-in-law who trusted each other enough to argue honestly across a family dinner table a year before it mattered, to finally close a gap that 3 otherwise excellent years of engineering had never quite found their way to on their own.